Well, thanks very much, Jim, and thanks, Ian. How do I follow that there? Come on. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Nuffield and the Thomas Henry Foundation. And I'd also like to thank the farm staff and my father for not burning the place down in my absence, and my partner Helen for your support. So let's get into it. I began in the knowledge that half of all the food consumed is grown using nitrogen derived from synthetic fertilizers derived from fossil fuels. And in the future, if that source was no longer available, then how is the dairy sector going to farm without it? Furthermore, phosphate reserves were going to be exhausted in a generation. And I wanted to understand if this fancy new term, regenerative agriculture, had the answers. 3 years on, as I finish, 2 European manufacturers have nitrogen produced from renewable energy. A huge phosphate deposit has been discovered in Norway, effectively doubling known reserves. And every agri-food company worth their salt has the words regenerative agriculture is shoehorned into their mission statement. So, that's my job done. Scholarship complete. Not quite. Here we have the carbon equivalent data for dairy farms, and fertilizer manufacture and nitrous oxide from the use, total 11%. But if we have to reduce the use of synthetic nitrogen, then we have to make more use of animal manures. And carbon equivalent emissions there from nitrous oxide and methane total another 19%. Well, that's 30% of a dairy farm's carbon equivalent emissions. And nutrient loss to the air and water causes damage to ecosystems, human health, and it's an economic loss to the farmer. This topic was huge, and I was convinced at the beginning of my scholarship that clovers had the answer. So I travelled to the USA, home of Regen Ag. This is Hamilton Dairy in Pennsylvania. They converted to organic a number of years ago and found the transition tough on the soils and the cows, mentally and economically. But after 2 years, they were thriving in a zero-end system, and the clovers have dominated. My conclusions from all my travel in the US is there's no doubt that Regen Ag works, but in a low stocking rate system. And I've been growing multi-species myself on the farm for about 5 or 6 years. And this is a silage field, it's only 12 months old, and that's the mix. But it's only worked along the hedgerow. And that's the problem, it's amazing along the side, and you might say, well, compaction's your problem there. But then, this me at the start of my scholarship in a grazing field, that's a 2-year-old lay at that point. And that's the same spot today, we're left with ryegrass and clover. It's exactly the same as Ian has found in his heavier soils. So then I thought, well, why don't we just breed ryegrass with many of the deep rooting benefits that multi-species have offered? So I put this to a breeder, and I was informed, in their words, that rooting mass and depth could easily be increased by 50%, but that it would come with a yield penalty because of the energy required to maintain said root mass. Therefore, it would never make the recommended lists which focused on yield and digestibility. But what I take from that, however, is that the genetic increase from yield has partly come from the detriment of root mass. And unlike breeding stations, who oversupply chemical fertilizer to find the elite genetics, I need the energy that's put into that root mass to feed soil biology, because I need that soil biology to mineralize my N, P, and K. So have modern ryegrass varieties lost their ability to interact properly with soil biology? And shallow roots have environmental implications too. Consider a grazing animal. She urinates in one spot, and the nitrogen contained in that urine passes out of the reach of shallow-rooted ryegrass in an instant, causing nitrogen leaching. And furthermore, one of the most effective ways to reduce ammonia emissions from a dairy herd is to extend grazing by 2 weeks. And that increase in the root mat should help achieve this. So why are rooting depth and mass not in this breeding criteria? And I was underwhelmed by this industry's awareness of their customers' needs and I want to see ambition with all sorts of new innovations and strategies to deal with the challenges that farmers face. Now I want to talk about nutrient accounting, and I can hear a collective groan from the farmers in the room, and I too enjoy paperwork like a punch in the face. But this is exactly the reason that I bring it up. Northern Ireland has had a Nutrients Action Programme for about 15 years. It's your equivalent of an NVZ. And under the current situation, we have to complete a nutrient management plan if we're above 170 kilograms of organic nitrogen a hectare. We take a soil analysis, slurry analysis, predict a crop yield, and then calculate a fertilizer application, and we develop a field-by-field nutrient management plan. And these management plans have lined the backs of field camps up and down the country, only to appear in inspection. And if you want to know how that's working out for us, Google Loch Ness algal bloom. Or is there another, more simpler way? This is the model used in the Netherlands, but I need to give you some context first. It's based on the law of conservation of mass. Elements can neither be made or destroyed. They just change from one form to another. So post-World War, we had small mixed farms. They kept livestock, they grew grass and grain to feed and bed those livestock. That was circular farming. Economics drove change, and a bid to spread costs over more milk, meat and grain, farms specialised. The result has been the loss of those circular nutrient flows. P and K have been mined and nitrogen created from deep carbon. It's applied in those arable farms, and then the nutrients contained in that grain have been transported to livestock farms. But here's the problem. Cows are only 30% efficient at putting nitrogen and phosphate into meat and milk. And that stark reality of that means that 70% of all the nutrients contained in the feed and the fertilizer that my grandfather has bought, that my dad has bought, and that I have bought are either still in my farm or have caused environmental pollution. Where else can they be? And if we explain that simple concept to farmers, they will understand the problem and that things have to change. So that's the first step. In the Netherlands, suppliers of inputs, concentrates and fertilizers, etc., report them online to a farm's nutrient calculator. Buyers and the cattle movement system report milk and meat outputs and movements, nutrients off the farm. Loss to the air and water is modelled, and that loss is then pegged to fertilizer prices. So if this was done in the UK, farmers for the first time would have an actual figure for nutrients on their farm. They could visualise this compared to fertilizer, and the numbers would mean something. Return on investment becomes clear when covering slurry stores, or importantly, the correct timing of slurry application. Achieving good environmental outcomes, and it's all driving behaviour change. And farmers would understand that they don't need to purchase phosphate and potassium fertilizers, and in fact they could export some, help the environment with no impact on their production. But how is this to be achieved? Slurry is over 90% water, and it's bulky and costly to transport. So I visited various nitrogen stripping technologies in the Netherlands, and for the average 200 cow dairy farm in the UK, nitrogen stripping technology is just financially out of reach. And most of these technologies help tackle ammonia emissions, but at a limited impact on methane, or provide a means to cycle phosphate back to the arable sector. Now, you can butcher that Welsh in your own head, but I'm going to call it a Welsh Agricologist Slurry Project. And in the dairy sector, if we focused on slurry separation, depending on the technology used, separated solids can contain between 10 and 70% of the phosphate contained within the slurry. However, to get to the 70%, you do need chemical flocculants. Now there's a means to cycle phosphate back to neighbouring farmers, such as sheep or an arable farm who need it. But there is a better way. And it wasn't until the end of August past that I found an economic model that really makes circular nutrients work. A research project in Northern Ireland by several biogas plants has found that separated slurry solids have 80% of the energy value of silage, putting a theoretical value of separated slurry solids at £30 a tonne. So using a centralised biogas model, any word of possibilities are now available. Ammonium sulphate, ammonium nitrate in liquid or prilled forms, and any number of dry P&K fertilizer products. So in conclusion, areas where they thrive, clovers and other legumes have a place in modern agriculture, as does chemical nitrogen and ryegrass. A linear nutrient flow has developed on the back of cheap energy, and this pollution has now come to critical mass. Along with the energy transition and available technology, nutrients can be cycled back to crop growers. Either way, productivity must be maintained, or production emissions will simply be exported. I'm excited about the opportunities the future holds. Agriculture simply needs to apply those circular farming principles, but to the country as a whole. Thank you very much.